All right, here we go for the war summary for January 19th to the 25th, 1917. General Maurice, Director of Military Operations at the War Office, declares that recent conferences of the chiefs of the Allies at Rome and in London were much more important in bringing victory nearer than any recent military event. The trench raids on the Western Front, he adds, continue with increasing success. The British troops in these raids bring back as many prisoners as their own total casualty lists, so that the enemy's dead and wounded are on the plus side of the ledger. The talk of an invasion of Switzerland by the Germans as a means of more easily getting at undefended parts of Italy and France is regarded as nothing more than talk by General Maurice. Germany, he says, has no means of obtaining men for such a campaign save by weakening other fronts, and this could only be done at great risk. The Swiss move to strengthen the garrisons of the passes of the Jura may therefore be regarded as precautionary and not the result of specific information as to Germany's plans. It is once more reported by Swiss newspapers, according to Geneva correspondent of the Exchange Telegraph Company, that masses of German troops are concentrating near Basel and that the Swiss General Staff is convinced that an invasion of Switzerland is contemplated with the view of freeing Alsace from the French invader. The appeal of the German General Staff to the people to abandon complaints, grumbling, and suspicion of others, and exercise moderation and judgment in respect to home affairs is a remarkable document. Everything, it says, depends upon not letting the spirit of the nation sink on account of the war. The appeal seems to bear out the statement that the mass of the German people are profoundly dissatisfied with their condition and are disposed not only to grumble, but to organize demonstrations against the authorities. This appears to be true more particularly of the people of Saxony, Bavaria, and the great industrial communities in the valley of the Rhine. The failure of the Romanian adventure to furnish supplies of grain and oil must now be apparent to the German people. The small quantities of cereals obtained have been apportioned for the most part to the Austro-Hungarians, whose grain shortage was more serious than that of the German states. The hope that Mackensen might be able to smash his way across Bessarabia to Odessa and capture or force the Russians to burn the greatest stocks of the wheat in the world has now vanished into thin air, following upon the reinforcement of the Russian armies in Romania. Once more, on all fronts, the Teutons are on the defensive. Fighting in the low-lying region between Braia and Galatz on the west side of the Danube continues. An unofficial report announced that the Germans had evacuated Braia, but no confirmation of this is contained in official statements. The Bulgars have been shelling the Russian positions from the eastern bank of the river and claim their fire was directed on large columns of troops and carts. The recapture of Vedeni may have induced the Russians to try for Berea. In the Carpathian region, the struggle remains indecisive, with heavy losses of men and few gains of territory on either side. The Romanians are taking an increasing part in the defense of their frontiers in this region and have evidently been re-equipped since the disasters of early December. In one of the engagements reported yesterday, it is stated they surrounded a height occupied by the enemy and took a great number of prisoners. The Romanian army may yet become an important factor in the operations on the Eastern Front. The French Midnight Report records artillery duels of a serious character in the Vosges, in Lorraine, and near Soissons. On the Aisne, elsewhere, all was calm. The British report tells of further progress during Wednesday night north of Beaucourt as a result of the successful local operations already mentioned. Berlin claims that the trenches between Beaucourt and Serre, recently occupied by the British, were evacuated almost a week ago. And for several days after the Germans had withdrawn, British guns continued to shell the empty trenches. Remember, the Hindenburg, the Siegfried line is, kicking into high gear. The situation in Greece is now reported as quite satisfactory to the Allies. My God. This just drives me up the tree. Oh my gosh. I'm not even Greek, for God's sakes. The threat of deposition apparently brought King Constantine up with a round turn. The adherents of Venizelos have been or being released. The troops in Thessaly are moving south. The railway facilities required by the Allies are evidently to be provided, and the military agents of Britain and Italy, who with their staffs have arrived at Athens, are satisfied with the progress made in carrying out the terms of the ultimatum. Oh my God. The supplementary terms, not included in the press dispatches, but afterwards made public by the government of Greece, indicate that extensive military operations are contemplated by the Allies in eastern Albania, and that for these operations, oh, here we get, I'm sorry, it just, when I read this a few days ago, I was out of my mind. And for these operations, the Greek railways will be brought into use. There's been evidence of late that Italy is to play an important part in the Balkans during the coming campaign. The increasing menace of submarines in the Mediterranean may render it advisable not only that the bulk of the troops required upon Sarai's left wing shall be Italian instead of French and English, transported long distances over dangerous seas, but that the British and French reinforcements required for the Balkan armies shall proceed overland through France and Italy to Brindisi, the Italian port on the Adriatic. The distance across the Straits of Otranto to Avlona in Albania is less than 75 miles, and the passage can be made under the protection of destroyers as safely as can that across the Straits of Dover. The distance from London to Salonika by this direct overland route is about 1,250 miles, and the only water stretches are those of the Straits of Dover, and of Otranto, less than 100 miles in all. From Southampton to Salonika by water is about 2,300 miles, and already the submarine perils are great. If Germany has 300 submarines of the most modern sort and process of completion, wow, remember they had less than 30 at the beginning of the war, of completion, General Sarai's supplies, munitions, and reinforcements must be carried over land to the Balkans, or the Balkan operations must be suspended when these submarines are let loose in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. A glance at any map showing the European and African shores of the Mediterranean must convince anyone that Allied shipping must, during the remainder of the war, pay an ever-increasing toll to the enemy's undersea boats while passing through the comparatively narrow stretch of sea between the southern coast of Sicily and the northern coast of Tunis, where all the destroyers of the British and French Navy on guard. There, the enemy submarines, handled with daring and skill, would continue to do much damage in the Malta Channel and to the westward. All ships from Britain and France bound for the east through the Suez Canal or the Levant, and all ships returning from the east and the Levant must pass either through the Strait of Messina or the wider passage south of Sicily. On these converging lines, the enemy's submarine strength will be directed more and more as his submarines increase in number. The overland route and Brindisi give the answer to this challenge. That is doubtless why the Italians are preparing to hold Albania with a great army and to make use in an increasing degree of the Greek railways. Yes, they're Greek, not Italian rail. Oh, on the Eastern Front, there are no signs of a renewal of the Teuton offensive, which appears to have spent itself on the Russian defensive lines west of the Sareth. Galatz is in less danger than a month ago. German heavy guns are being used to bombard Okna in the valley of the Trotus, but Okna is well to the west of the Sareth lines and less than 20 miles from the frontier of Transylvania. If a 2 months persistent offensive in this region has carried the Teutons less than 20 miles beyond their own frontier, the possibility of the conquest of Moldavia before the spring breakup is a slender one. The British government has found it necessary to put an end to rumors regarding impending changes in the higher commands in France, which would give General Nivelle control over the British armies, by stating that no changes are contemplated and that the subject has not even been discussed. There is little news in any of the official reports. Berlin says no incidents of importance have been reported from any front. Paris tells of a sharp artillery actions on the Verdun front, especially in the vicinity of Hill 304, while the Belgian statement records an artillery duel of great intensity in the region of Ramschapelle. The British report tells of the dispersal of German working parties along the Ancre and the shelling of enemy positions in the vicinity of La Bassée Canal. A serious explosion is reported in a munitions factory near London, involving considerable destruction of life and property. The British Army in Mesopotamia has made another advance on the right bank of the Tigris, northeast of Kut El Amara. An official statement issued last night announces that the whole Turkish trench system on a front of 2,500 yards to a depth of 1,100 yards is now in the possession of General Maud's army, and that the right bank of the river from Kut El Amara downstream has been cleared of the Turks. Operations southwest of Kut El Amara are also reported. A Turkish headquarters report of a prior date to this stated that heavy losses had been sustained by the British in operations east of Kut El Amara, that the Turks had held their ground, and that in an attack by Turkish cavalry on a British cavalry brigade, the British had suffered severely. That would be neat to see. Whatever truth there may be in this report, it is evident that the later statement of General Maud shows that the actual present conditions. Berlin announces that the entire bridgehead position at Nănești on the Sereth line in northern Romania has been captured, together with the town. The Russians, it is stated, suffered severe losses in crossing the Sereth bridges, and 556 prisoners were left in the hands of the Teutons. Standing as it does, this report would suggest that Falkenhayn, in his drive east in the valley of the Trotus, has arrived on the west bank of the Sereth River. The town of Nănești, however, is not on the Sereth at all, but on a tributary of the Trotus, and is situated fully 20 miles from the Sereth. It is quite manifest, therefore, that the bridges spoken of in the German report are not on the Sereth itself, but at Nănești. Much hard fighting confronts Falkenhayn before he wins his way to the Sereth. Elsewhere in Romania, the Germans have made practically no progress. In the Brăila Galați section, the Russians not only hold their own, but appear to have strengthened their positions. Northward of the Putna Valley, they are still on the offensive. Berlin states that an attempted attack by the Russians in this region was broken up, and that minor advances elsewhere were repulsed. There has been renewed activity in central Galicia and in Volhynia. The Russians report the shelling of the German positions in the region of Kovel, and the damaging of the enemy's trenches and wire entanglements at various points. The Germans have brought up heavy guns against the Russian trenches on Narukivia River and have done some damage, but no infantry action followed the bombardment. Despite the very severe weather in the Balkans, there is renewed artillery activity on the Vardar and in the direction of Doran. The Russians, who form part of the army of Salonika, have carried out a successful raid, and patrol encounters have taken place on other parts of the front, especially on the Struma, where the British hold the line. The British Army in Flanders and France keeps the Germans in a continual state of uneasiness. On Saturday, British troops raided the German lines near Saint-Éloi and north of Neuchâtel, and on Sunday morning, a successful daylight raid was carried out southeast of Luss. Dugouts full of Germans were bombed and destroyed, and many casualties inflicted on the enemy at small cost to the raiders. The superiority of the British artillery greatly adds to the success of these frequent trench raids. The guns drop shells so rapidly on the enemy's trenches that their occupants seek shelter in the dugouts, and then the raiders make a rush across no man's land and bomb the dugouts before their occupants can emerge. Inaction still prevails along the greater part of the French front. On Saturday night, the Germans made an attempt to reach the French trenches in the vicinity of La Seignée, but were easily repulsed and left a number of prisoners behind them. On the right bank of the Meuse, there was artillery and patrol activity on Saturday, and on Sunday, this increased materially. A Paris Midnight Report states that the guns of both armies were very active in the sectors immediately east of the Meuse and in the wood of Corrières. There was fighting in Alsace in the region of Altkirch. The Germans there, who attempted to reach the French trenches by surprise, were driven back. Artillery fire increases on the Belgian front. it is announced that on Saturday in the neighborhood of Dixmude, violent artillery duels were fought, and that farther to the south, there were spirited actions with field and trench artillery in the region of Steenstraat. In President Wilson's address on foreign relations before the Senate of the United States, in the course of which he stated that a lasting peace, such as the United States would be prepared to defend and guarantee, must be a peace without victory. He also declared that no peace can last or ought to last which does not recognize and accept the principle that governments derive all their just powers from the consent of the governed, and that no right anywhere exists to hand people's, about from sovereignty to sovereignty as if they were property. I take it for granted, for instance, if I may venture upon a single example, that statesmen everywhere are agreed that there should be a united, independent, and autonomous Poland, and that henceforth inviolable security of life, of worship, and industrial and social developments should be guaranteed to all peoples who have lived hitherto under the power of governments devoted to a faith and purpose hostile to their own. That's the end of President Wilson for now. Well, maybe not actually here. Following the text of President Wilson's statement, a dispatch was received by the Globe showing how far the European state system is from making the making of peace along the lines he suggests. The text of a judgment pronounced in Vienna a little over 2 weeks ago against Dr. Kramaric and the other leaders of the Czech or Bohemian National Party has reached Switzerland. In sending the Czech leaders to penal servitude, the court declared that their agitation had led to regrettable manifestations of the Czech population, which had formed a serious obstruction to the successful conclusion of the war. They were held responsible for the surrender of Czech soldiers in the Russian campaign, for riots perpetrated by Bohemian troops in different towns in Austria, and for the undermining of military discipline, which had operated to the advantage of Russia against Austria. If Poland, dismembered for over a century, is to be granted freedom on racial grounds, what of the Czechs, the Romanians of Transylvania, the Italians of the Tyrol, the Armenians, the Arabs, the Serbs of Bosnia, and all other little subject peoples over whom the Teutons of Germany and Austria and the Magyars and the Turks bear rule? The speeches bring into high relief once more the unquestionable fact that the Austrian Empire would cease to exist were it required to secure, as a condition of continued existence, the consent of the governed. The allies who have borne the burden and heat of the day are scarcely likely at this moment, when all fronts they are preparing for the spring offensive, to listen to a plea for peace without victory. My God, does this ever dovetail well with William Aarons' poem and stuff and his translator's notes? The British government has called up for some defense all youths of 18 years of age. They will be kept in training till they reach the age of 19. Heretofore, although service was compulsory for youths of 18, they have not been called up until they reach the age of 18 years and 7 months. The step will add over 200,000 youths at once to the total number under arms in the United Kingdom and release that number of trained men for service abroad. The British Night Report tells of the failure of a German attempt to raid the British line near Arras on Sunday night. The enemy suffered losses and failed to enter the trenches attacked. Last night, another attempt near Ploegsteert Wood was equally unsuccessful. Along the Ancre and north of Arras, the British secured some prisoners as a result of patrol and bombing encounters. The French Night Report says yesterday was calm, save for artillery activity north of Verdun and in the Vosges. There has been no renewal of German activity at Verdun. The enemy there made 2 attempts on Sunday to reach the French positions, but without success. The increase in German activity in Alsace after a long period of calm gives an air of probability to the assertion that troops from the Eastern Front are being hurried across Central Europe as they were at this time last year for the assault on Verdun. The spring breakup will begin in southeastern Europe in another month, And during March and April, throughout a region of swollen rivers, mud roads, and few railways, little can be done by troops that must have the aid of heavy artillery. The better rail and road system of France makes an earlier opening of the campaign possible in that country. It is entirely possible, therefore, that a repetition of the German Verdun offensive of last year may be staged at some point in Alsace or Lorraine in the hope of upsetting the plans of the Allies. There has been no change of importance in Romania. The Turks and Bulgars, who constitute the major part of Mackenson's Danubian army, have failed to shake the Russian hold on Galatz. In East Africa, the remnants of the German and colored troops have been driven south toward the delta of the Rufiji River, a low-lying, fever-infested region where resistance can not long be continued. Operations there consist of manhunting on a large scale rather than regular warfare. What a way to put it. 2 sharp engagements on Monday night between British and German war vessels are officially reported by the British Admiralty, the known results of which are the sinking of a German destroyer and the infliction of a considerable punishment on other vessels of the division to which it belonged, in an encounter with British patrols off the Dutch coast, and the torpedoing by the enemy and the sinking later by her own consorts of a British destroyer during a second encounter off Schwoven Bank. The loss of life in this case was 3 officers and 44 men. Unofficial reports from correspondents of Reuters agency in Holland say that the engagement followed attempts made by German torpedo vessels to leave Zeebrugge to avoid the ice, which was very thick. They were attacked shortly afterwards by a British squadron. The German destroyer V-69 was badly damaged by shell fire and was towed into the Dutch port of Umeeden with 20 of her crew dead aboard of her. 16 severely wounded members of the crew had previously been landed at by a Dutch steamer. From the statements of the men of the V-69, it would appear that of 14 German destroyers which left Zeebrugge, 7 were sunk by the British. There is no suggestion in the Admiralty report of a victory so important. It states that one of the German vessels was sunk and the rest scattered, but that darkness prevented the full results of the action from being observed. This V-69 and the unintended vessel sunk were probably the chief losses of the enemy. The action once more proves that there's no safety for German warships outside of German harbors or the protection of German minefields. The Schwoven Bank is north of the estuary of the Scheldt, and that place lies 50 miles farther up the Dutch coast. The German destroyers were evidently headed towards the Elbe when intercepted. Berlin announces that the Bulgars in the Dobruja have crossed the south branch of the Danube near Tulcha, about 30 miles from the mouth of the river, and have maintained themselves on the northern bank against Russian attacks. The news is not of serious import. The occupation of both banks of the river at Tulcha will prevent Russian light draft war vessels from ascending the river by that branch, but the northern one is still open and controlled by Russia as far upriver as the port of Ismail in Bessarabia. From Moldavia, in Galicia and Volhynia, there are reports of outpost affairs and trench raids. The German advance in Romania has practically come to a standstill all along the front from the Danube to the borders of Bukovina. The night report from Paris tells of artillery activity in Champagne, the Argonne, Lorraine, and Alsace. A surprise attack was made by the French on the German lines near Reichskuhl in Lorraine. The increase in the number of raids in Lorraine and of artillery activity indicates that the French are seeking to discover what truth there is in the assertion that an important German concentration is proceeding in Lorraine and Alsace. The Belgian reports tell of artillery actions all along the Belgian front. In the region of Hexas, the artillery duel and the bomb fighting were characterized by great violence. The Germans are apparently steadily increasing the number of their guns on this part of the front. Berlin claims that during 1916, the Allies on all fronts lost 784 airplanes and the Teutons 221. The Allies doubtless lost more heavily than the enemy because their aviators, especially on the Western Front, operated far more frequently over the German lines than did the German aviators over the lines of the Allies. But Berlin is probably seeing double and counting as losses all Allied airplanes driven down, as well as those known to have been destroyed. General Haig's night report records a successful British trench raid yesterday morning near Neuville-Saint-Vaast, which resulted in the capture of some prisoners. On Monday night, the Germans, during a raid north of Armentières, reached the British trenches, but were at once driven out. The raiders came under machine gun fire, both going and returning, and left a number of dead in front of the British lines. There was a good deal of artillery activity on both sides yesterday, and the British aviators cooperated closely with the guns. Good results were obtained. The Turks assert that the trenches east of Kut El Amara, abandoned on Friday last by them, were bombarded all night by the British river fleet and heavy guns. The British force, which was afterwards sent forward to occupy the trenches, is said to have suffered serious losses from Turkish flanking fire. That is probably Constantinople's way of breaking the news of a serious loss of ground. Russians were pushed back 1.5 miles in the Riga region, Petrograd admits in an official dispatch. The Germans attacked in considerable force, a vigorous bombardment of the Russian lines between the Tyrol swamp west of Riga and the river Ah, and also east of Kelzim village. The enemy followed his old tactics of sending wave after wave of German troops against the Russian detachments, the ice on the Tyrol Marsh favoring offensive operations. Berlin claims the capture of 1,500 Russian prisoners. According to the Russian report, stubborn fighting is continuing. In the Vinsk region, southwest of Ilukst, the Russians repelled repeated advances of the enemy with their fire. Fighting on the northern end of the Russian front apparently is assuming serious proportions, the object of the Russians in resuming operations on the extreme wing being to relieve the pressure on the Romanian front. The night dispatch from Paris reports violent artillery operations in the region of Moulins-sous-Touran, northeast of Hill 304, and in the Bois-Courrières sector. The enemy delivered 2 surprise attacks east of Soissons and at Eparges, both of which were repulsed by the French, who took some prisoners. Intermittent artillery fire is reported from the rest of this front at Dixmude, Steenstraat, Hestas, and northeast of Beaussigny. The Belgian artillery, oh, shoots and ladders, I did it again. Where am I here? There we go. The Belgian artillery had a lively engagement with the enemy's guns and made good practice against the German positions. Southwest of Luss, an enemy raid against the British lines were beaten off without difficulty. The Germans left a number of dead and wounded behind when they were driven back. The British loss was very slight. South of Hulk, another German raiding party was caught by the British fire and forced to retire. During the night, says the British report, enemy trenches were successfully entered southeast of Ypres, north of the Somme, and in the vicinity of Armentières and Ypres. The artillery was active during the day. Southeast of Souchez, the British guns bombarded the enemy trenches and works. It was a day of great activity for the aerial scouts on both sides. The Germans lost 6 airplanes and 3 were driven down in a damaged condition. The British had 2 missing and 1 brought down. In the Dobruja region, the Bulgarian detachment, which Berlin yesterday reported had crossed the Danube at Tucha, was surprised and destroyed by the Russians, according to a Petrograd report. The Russians took 337 prisoners and 4 machine guns. The Bulgarian force numbered about 1,000 men. The Russians attacked with the bayonet in the dead of night without opening fire. Oh my God. Estimating the German losses at about 2 million men. The National Zeitung of Berlin claims that Germany has sufficient men to carry on the war for several more years. German figures have been proved to be so unreliable that credence can be attached to that little credence can be attached to such estimates. I know, it's like, what the hell? It is stated by this Berlin paper that German reserves still number 7 millions, and that these must be added another 1.5 million of German lads who have reached military age since the war began. In the United Kingdom, the process continues of forging all the available resources of the country into an efficient weapon of war. The food dictator, oh my, what a crazy term, eh? Has decided to cut down the quantity of beer permitted to be brewed so as to increase the supply of available food. Another important fact is the attitude of organized labor, which has rallied wholeheartedly to the support of the new government. As indicating the subordination of private to national interests, it is announced that the government has refused to allow a private munitions firm to fill an order for shells received from the United States naval authorities. The order is that no shells for export shall be manufactured so long as the exigencies of the war continue. I have to look up that word. In the naval, and I think this is it, yes, it is. This is the last paragraph. In the naval fight on Monday, it is reported from Holland, 6 to 10 German destroyers were sunk. Of the crew of 160 on board, the battered V-69, which limped into port at whatever, in a sinking condition, there are only 60 survivors, of whom 20 are badly wounded. Later accounts of the engagement show that the British victory was greater than at first reported. Hope that went well, and I hope to see you next week, and hope you have a great week. Bye.